One thing that is particularly challenging in journalism broadly, but I think especially in cryptocurrency, is trying to figure out how to manage potential conflicts of interest. What are your personal thoughts on that, recognizing that they may be different than your organization's general policies?
Yeah, so I mean, well, let me ask you this. Are we talking about owning crypto, or are we talking about, for example, our corporate parentage? Because I think I have different views on both.
I think both end up mattering at different points, right?
Absolutely.
Um, uh, I think it clearly can matter when reporters are invested, and I think that people have a habit of assuming the corporate ownership of a media company tends to influence what it reports, and so I think both of those dynamics are pretty important
That's
here.
fair. So I'll take the personal investing idea first. So I personally don't invest in crypto. I have less than $100 each of Bitcoin and Ether. It's really less than, I think, $50. I haven't checked. I honestly have no idea what they're worth at this point. I know.
It was less than 100, and now it's less than 50.
Sounds right. Yeah. Yeah. Like I basically I bought some Bitcoin to play around with wallets. I got some Ether while selling some tweets as NFTs. Basically, I was just playing around with stuff and have crypto as a result of that. And I think, for me, it makes sense because I'm not really interested in investing in crypto. I'm not interested in, my investments are in things like Boeing stock, which is down, and like the S&P 500, which I don't know what that's at. But I do understand why, several of my colleagues may invest in crypto because some of them are true believers in this sector and they're here to report on it because they think it'll make them better at what they do. And some of them report on or invest on things that they report on because it gives them a better understanding of what they're covering. So, I personally don't want to invest in crypto, but I don't necessarily disagree with those who do. I do think having a very strong disclosure program is important because it lets the reader kind of evaluate, okay, well, this person's heavily invested in this coin and they've written nothing but positive stories about this coin, so maybe they're a biased, source. Or, maybe they're, writing about it, but they're not, they don't have a particular bent, but they are invested in it, so maybe they're invested in it because it gives them a better understanding or lets them participate in things that they otherwise could not do. And an example of that, I think, yesterday one of my colleagues, Danny Nelson, wrote this insane piece about Solana. It turns out that much of Solana's TVL, total value locked, was a result of one individual pretending to be 11 different developers. And this is the kind of story where you don't really get into it unless you're deep in the weeds on the Solana developer community. And to do that, you really need to be able to own some Solana because some of these communities are, gate locked. You can't get into them unless you can prove that you have, X number of tokens. You can't really participate unless you understand what you're talking about. And so I think it makes sense to be able to, take advantage of having these projects to say, all right, well, okay, so he owns some Solana and that let him get access to all these resources and these people that let him break, frankly, a story that's not very good for Solana. So, clearly he's not just writing, in his own financial interests, but he wouldn't have been able to get the story, I don't think, without being able to invest in it. So that's what I'm saying when I say, having a strong disclosure program, I think is important. I do understand those news organizations that bar their reporters from investing in crypto entirely, but I also disagree with that because there are a lot of reporters out there who I think cover crypto without necessarily understanding what they're talking about. And I think that's a problem. This is an industry that deserves really good scrutiny, very close scrutiny, but that scrutiny can't happen if if you understand Bitcoin as just kind of the surface level thing and you don't spend the time saying, okay, well, this is how Bitcoin transactions work. Here's how actually, mining really works. Here's how these different companies in this sector actually interact with each other. And it's the same with any other industry, really. It's just that Bitcoin and the crypto industry at large are kind of different because to understand that, to get in deep in there, you kind of have to get involved a little bit financially speaking. If that makes sense.
I mean, I don't know how much I agree with that. I think I do get your point. I get your point insofar as I think you're right that there's no reason to bar people who own some cryptocurrency from reporting on it. And as you're suggesting, there's plenty of people who do own and still report negative news stories about the things that they own. And to further that point a little bit, I would say A great example of this is Rupert Murdoch being an investor in Theranos, and yet still having John Carreyrou report all the negative stuff on Elizabeth Holmes and Theranos. So there's plenty of examples of people who are investors still doing the right thing. However, I do want to push back against the idea that you really should be utilizing the instrument regularly to have a full understanding
I don't know if I'd say
of
that.
it. I mean, I
I'm
think
saying that I don't think that's what I'm saying. I'm saying that being able to have that ability, and you don't need a lot of Bitcoin or anything to do it, but just being able to really understand it. Sometimes you do need to play around with it, and maybe this is less applicable for Bitcoin than it is for other cryptocurrencies. It's really a lot of these smaller, weirder projects that people are pouring tons of money into that receive less scrutiny, that might be harder to really be to understand without being able to join these communities and participate in them. So absolutely agree with what you're saying. For sure, there's absolutely zero reason for people to have to heavily invest in stuff to write about it. But sometimes it just might be,
I think
it might make sense to understand it if you're able to play around with some of these esoteric tools.
I think that, but I think there's still potentially a gap there between like having enough of a token to be able to get past a token gate, like while you're working on an article or whatever, and having like an investment, having a meaningful financial interest in like the price direction of the coin, right? Because I think you're right that it can be helpful to play around with some of these things. Often, like when I'm choosing not to play around with it, it takes me probably an additional amount of time to like read through the contracts and really go through the calls and understand it without like just doing the things, because I'm trying to be extra cautious to avoid that potential conflict of interest. But like I do feel like there's a distinction between having a few of the tokens to get into a Discord and having a vested financial interest in the project. Do you think that I'm reading too much into that difference, or?
No, I agree, absolutely. I mean, again, this is why I don't have a lot of Bitcoin or Ether. It's because what little I have is enough for me to play around with it. People who are heavily financially invested, then if they're reporters, then that's their choice. I wouldn't agree with that choice. I don't necessarily. I definitely don't agree with it. But for some of them, I do know some of my own colleagues might be described as such, and so I'm not going to judge them. But for me personally, absolutely, I wouldn't want to go that far.
Yeah, and to be clear, many people who do have large vested financial interests in these things have done very good journalistic work, have put out excellent reporting, and I want to make sure that's clear. I'm not saying people can't do good work while having these vested financial interests.
Well, I think Nick started it by talking about Danny Nelson and the Solana story. So I think we already that's clear. We can understand that there's reporters doing good work while owning the tokens. But I think my question is more about like access journalism and how like it's almost like it instantly becomes access journalism in a sense, as even though it's like, yeah, he's still reporting bad stuff, he's still able to be critical, but like he did have to purchase some of this thing to even be able to essentially get to that access point. And like, don't you think there's a bit of an issue with that?
If there is, I'd say it's because it's like an industry kind of defined problem, right? I mean, my understanding is that some of these stories that we've published, they're things that are kind of open secrets within some small circles of the community. So, for example, just going back to the Solana thing because it's a recent example, a lot of Solana developers were saying this was an open secret within the Solana developer community. But this is not something that the reception of this story shows us. It's not something that was widely known, and I'm not really sure how else we might have been able to report that, right? This depended on a unpublished document that was shared with a CoinDesk reporter that, the CoinDesk reporter had to then spend quite a bit of time verifying with people who were, part of this community. And one thing we found is that, to Bennett's point earlier, without having a token, sure, a lot of this stuff can be found, but it does take more time. And, there's really only so much time. And this is what I think the difference between being a journalist and being a researcher comes in, is that as journalists, we would love to be able to spend, as much time as needed to, hone in on certain stories and really polish them up and make them look as sharp as possible. But sometimes we are restricted by the amount of time we have available and the demands of the rest of our jobs. And our research folks, they have the ability to spend a bit more time on things. They don't, they're not necessarily constrained by the same kinds of deadlines, but at the same time, they also publish less and they publish less frequently. So, that I think is just kind of one of the, tightropes we have to walk is how do we balance not going, too far into this access part of it while also not taking too much time, while also not, underserving our readers.